The night was completely silent when Kael Draconis walked across the great stone bridge that stretched above the dark valley of Vorthal. There was no wind. There were no sounds from the city below. Every wolf in that city had gone still the moment they sensed him moving through the night, the way small animals go still when something large and ancient passes by. They were not afraid in the way that makes a person run. They were afraid in the way that makes a person understand, deeply and without question, that some things in this world exist on a level far above anything they have ever known. Kael was tall and broad, with silver eyes that caught the faint light of the stars above him. His black cloak moved slowly behind him as he walked, though there was no wind to push it. He had ruled for 300 years. He had seen empires rise and collapse. He had watched rivers change their course, and mountains lose their peaks to time. He had buried friends, enemies, and everyone in between. And yet he walked with the steady, unhurried steps of a man who had nowhere else to be and nothing left to fear. He stopped at the center of the bridge and looked out at the horizon. It was something he did often, alone, late at night. Not because he was looking for anything. He had simply learned, long ago, that stillness was its own kind of power. He had not been born into power. That was the part of his story that people always forgot, or perhaps never knew. The legends spoke of him as though he had arrived in the world already great, already unbreakable. But the truth was far less comfortable than that. He had been born the seventh son of a disgraced alpha in a small, forgotten pack on the cold northern edges of the continent. His father had made enemies among the powerful clans. His pack had been small and proud and stubborn, and those were exactly the qualities that certain powerful people found threatening. When Kael was 5 years old, 4 rival clans had joined forces and descended on his home on a night very much like this one, quiet and dark and without warning. He had woken up to the sound of his family fighting. He had heard his brothers, one by one, go silent. He had heard his mother's voice calling his name before she, too, went quiet. By the time the night was over, Kael was the only one left. He had crawled out from beneath the floorboards where his oldest brother had hidden him before going out to fight. He had walked through what remained of his home and understood, with the cold clarity that only a child who has lost everything can feel, that no one was coming to help him. He buried his family himself. It took him 2 days. The ground was frozen and his hands were small, and he stopped many times to rest, but he never stopped completely. When the last of them was buried, he stood over the graves and felt something move inside him. Not grief alone, something else. Something that had been sleeping underneath the grief, like a fire waiting for air. He howled once, just once, and the ice on the river half a mile away cracked down the middle. He did not know what that meant at the time. He only knew that he was alone, and that he was still breathing, and that as long as he was still breathing, the story was not finished. He moved into the frozen forest, and he survived. He learned what to eat and how to stay warm, and how to move quietly, so that nothing found him before he found it. He grew stronger, he grew faster. He learned to listen to the forest, and to the wind, and to the strange, deep pulse of something inside him that always seemed to know what to do before his mind caught up. By the time he was a young man, he had grown into something that was difficult to look at directly, not because he was frightening exactly, but because standing near him felt like standing near a waterfall. You could feel the force of it even before you understood what you were looking at. Lone wolves began to appear at the edges of his camp. They came one at a time, from different directions, from different packs they had left or been cast out from. They did not ask to join him. They simply sat down nearby and waited, as though they had been walking towards something they could not name, and had finally found it. He let them stay, he fed them, he listened to them. He was not warm in the way that makes people feel comfortable, but he was honest, and he was consistent, and he never asked anyone to do something he was not willing to do himself. That, it turned out, was more than enough. By the time he was 23 years old, 12 warring packs had united beneath a single banner. Not through tricks, not through political promises, or gifts, or marriages, or any of the methods that leaders in history had used to gather power. They came because he was the kind of thing that only comes along once, if at all. They came because when he stood in a room, every instinct in every wolf's body said, without question, Without debate, this is the one. The world of supernatural beings had always been loud and violent and divided. Werewolves and vampires and fae and various other ancient creatures had been fighting among themselves since before any written record could capture. Territory disputes, ancient grudges, pride and hunger and fear, these were the engines that kept the conflict going, generation after generation. Kael did not end all of that. He simply became the weight at the center of it, the point around which everything else had to organize. And slowly, cautiously, the fighting quieted. Not because anyone particularly wanted peace, but because making an enemy of the Alpha King had become something that even the bravest and most reckless among them had stopped being willing to do. The moment that changed everything, the moment that crossed from the mortal world into something far older, came during what history would later call the Battle of Seren's Gate. 4 armies had gathered on the borders of his territory, 2 werewolf coalitions, a vampire empire, and a battalion of fae warriors who had decided, together, that it was time to remove Kael before he became something none of them could deal with. Their intelligence told them that this was the moment. Their numbers told them that they could not lose. Kael met them at the gate, alone. There were no soldiers behind him. There was no strategy in the conventional sense. He simply stood at the gate as the armies spread out across the valley below, and he looked at them with those silver eyes, and then something happened that no one who was present ever fully found the words to describe. It began as a feeling. Everyone felt it at the same time. Soldiers in all 4 armies, commanders on horseback, scouts in the trees. A pressure, not painful, but enormous. Like the air had suddenly become something heavier than air. Like the ground had developed a gravity of its own. Every werewolf soldier in both opposing packs went to their knees. Not because they decided to. Their bodies simply moved before their minds had a chance to object. It was the deepest, most fundamental level of werewolf instinct, the part that recognizes an alpha so far above anything they have ever encountered that the only response the body knows is submission, and it fired in every single one of them simultaneously, without exception. The vampires, who felt no such instinct, did not kneel. But they stopped. Every single one of them stopped moving and stood very still, and the looks on their faces were not the looks of soldiers halted by a command. They were the looks of very old, very experienced creatures who had just encountered something they had not prepared for, something that sat above them on a scale they had not previously known existed. The Fae General was 3,000 years old. She had fought in wars that most living beings had never heard of. She had seen things that would have broken any ordinary mind. She turned her army around without a single word and walked them back the way they had come. The battle lasted 11 minutes. No one fired an arrow. No one drew a sword. 4 armies stood or knelt on that valley floor and came to the same quiet, private conclusion. Not today. Not ever, perhaps, but certainly not today. In the realm above the mortal world, where the ancient gods had watched over creation since before the first sunrise, a god named Varath, the god of dominion, the eldest and most powerful of the divine council, stood up from his throne. Around him, the other gods leaned forward to look through the veil between their world and the one below. They watched what had happened at Seren's Gate. They watched in silence, and then Varath sat back down and looked around at his peers. "Leave him," he said quietly. No one argued. None of this was known to the woman who arrived in Vorthal on a cold afternoon some years later, carrying a small wounded child she had found abandoned near the border roads. She had not planned to enter the city. She had only come because the child needed warmth and medicine, and she did not know where else to go. Her name was Seraphine Ash. She was half mortal, half fae, and she had spent most of her life deliberately staying at the edges of the supernatural world, not because she was afraid of it, but because she had seen enough of its politics and its power games to want no part of them. She was a healer. She moved where she was needed, and she left when her work was done, and she answered to no one. She walked into the Alpha King's court without an appointment, without permission, and without lowering her eyes. Every wolf in the room felt the shift immediately. The court had a particular quality to it, like a room in which the temperature was always exactly right and every sound was precisely measured. And this woman had walked into it as though it were an ordinary hallway. The guards stiffened. The advisors exchanged glances. No one quite knew what to do, because nothing like this had happened before. Kael was seated at the far end of the hall. He watched her cross the floor with the child in her arms, watched her stop at a reasonable distance and look at him directly, and he felt something in his chest move. It was a sensation so unfamiliar that it took him a long moment to understand what it was. He had felt many things over 300 years. He had not, in a very long time, felt surprised. She explained the situation. The child, the border road, the need for medical supplies. She spoke clearly and efficiently, and without any of the usual performances that people put on when they stood before him. She did not compliment him. She did not appear nervous. She simply told him what she needed, and waited for his answer. He gave her everything she asked for, and then, because he was not entirely sure what else to do, he asked her to stay. She agreed, but only because the child needed continued care. She made that very clear. What followed was unlike anything the court of Vorthal had ever witnessed. Seraphine argued with Kael openly in council meetings. She questioned decisions he had made. She pointed out, calmly and with specifics, when she thought he was wrong. She fell asleep in the library during a meeting she had not been invited to, and apologized to no one. She treated the wolves around her with warm, easy friendliness, and treated the Alpha King with the same matter-of-fact directness she used with everyone else. The court watched this with a mixture of fascination and quiet terror, waiting for the moment Kael would end it. The moment never came. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The Alpha King, the man who had made 4 armies stand down without raising his hand, the man the gods themselves had agreed to leave undisturbed, began to change in ways that were small and quiet and completely unmistakable to anyone paying attention. He smiled more. Not often, but more. He stayed in the library later. He asked her opinion on matters that had nothing to do with medicine. He listened when she spoke, not with the polite patience he gave to advisors, but with genuine attention, the kind that means the other person's words are actually landing somewhere. Seraphine noticed all of this, and said nothing about it, because she was practical, and because she knew that naming something too early could ruin it. But she noticed, and in the quiet of her own thoughts, she understood that she had walked into Vorthal to help a child, and had somehow found herself next to the center of the world. Not every ancient and powerful being had the wisdom of the Divine Council. There was one who had been watching Kael for a very long time from a distance, not with fear, but with hunger. His name was Sorath. He had once been part of the Divine Council, but he had been cast out long ago for crimes against mortal races that the Council had refused to forgive. He had spent 1,000 years in the spaces between worlds, growing colder and more calculating, studying everything and waiting. What Sorath had understood, through long and careful observation, was something that the Council knew, but never said aloud. Kael's power was not ordinary alpha dominance, amplified over years. It was something that predated ordinary. It was the original force, the first and purest form of energy from which werewolves had been created at the very beginning of things. It had been thought lost. It had not been lost. It had been waiting in a bloodline that everyone had dismissed and nearly destroyed. Sorath wanted that power, and he had finally found his angle. He could not challenge Kael directly. He had tried, in his calculations, to find a version of that confrontation that ended in his favor, and he had found none. But Kael, for all his impossible strength, had developed a point of vulnerability that he had not had before, a healer with gray eyes who walked through his court like she owned it. Sorath moved quietly. He placed a curse on Seraphine, a divine working, old and precise, designed not to destroy her but to hollow her out slowly, pulling at the fey half of her essence like a thread being unraveled from a piece of cloth. She would not die quickly. She would fade. And when she was faded enough, she would be useful to him in other ways. She felt it begin as exhaustion, then as something deeper than exhaustion. She told no one, because she did not want to concern the people around her, and because she was, by nature, someone who solved her own problems. But she could not solve this one. It was beyond anything mortal medicine could address. It was beyond even fey healing. It was divine in origin, and the only thing that can remove a divine working is a force that operates on the same level or above it. Kael found out on a Tuesday evening, when he went to the library, and she was not there. She was in her room, and the healer who had examined her was standing outside the door with a face that told him everything, before a word was spoken. What happened to the world after that was not something that can be fully described in orderly sentences. The temperature dropped across the entire continent over the course of an hour. 7 degrees, measured later by those who kept such records. Every wolf on the continent stopped what they were doing at the same moment and looked north, pulled by something they did not understand. The river beneath the obsidian bridge in Vorthal froze solid for the first time in 200 years. Kael did not pace. He did not shout. He went very, very still. And then he walked out to the open field outside the city walls, stood beneath the dark sky, and said one word. A name. Sorath came. He came because he had been planning this confrontation for a long time, and because he believed, with the confidence of a being who had survived 1,000 years of exile, that he had accounted for every possibility. He came with 6 shadow warriors and the full force of the power he had accumulated over a millennium. The fight lasted less than 2 minutes. It was not a matter of strength matching strength. It was something altogether different. When Sorath reached for his power, he found that it was not functioning. Not taken, not blocked, but simply not functioning, the way a flame cannot exist in a place with no air. Kael's presence, in its fully awakened state, had restructured the fundamental conditions of everything within a wide distance, and in those conditions, Sorath's borrowed divine power had nothing to stand on. Kael removed the curse from Seraphine with his hands. Literally, with his hands, reaching into the fey essence of her in a way that should have been impossible, finding the foreign thread that did not belong, and pulling it free. It was not elegant. It cost him something. But he did not stop until it was done, and she was breathing easily, and the color was coming back to her face. Sorath, face down in the field outside Vorthal, experienced helplessness for the first time in over 1,000 years. Kael did not end him. He sealed him instead, conscious and fully aware, in a prison made from the same origin force that Sorath had wanted so badly. A handful of wolves were assigned to guard the seal. As long as they kept their vigil, they would not age. It was not mercy. It was a message, written clearly enough that no one who heard of it would need it explained. In the divine realm, the Council of Gods had watched everything. When it was over, Vareth looked around the table at his peers. He let the silence sit for a moment. "Anyone?" he said. No one moved. He nodded once. "As I thought." Seraphine was sitting up when Kael came back to her room. She looked at him, the way she always looked at him. Straight on, without performance or distance. She looked tired, but herself. Entirely and completely herself, which was the only thing he had needed to confirm. She said nothing for a while. Then she said, "You made gods flinch." "One," he said. "One god." The rest of them watched and did nothing. "That is a different kind of flinching," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. 300 years of history stood behind his eyes, and she could see it there, all that weight and time and solitude. She reached over and put her hand in his. He looked down at it. He did not move away. "What do you actually want?" she asked. Not as a subject asking a king, as someone asking another person a question they genuinely did not know the answer to yet. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the river was beginning to thaw. Somewhere in the city below, a wolf was singing. One of the old songs, low and steady, the kind that has no particular beginning or end. "This," he said finally, "this is enough." She nodded, as though that was a perfectly reasonable answer. As though it made complete sense that the most powerful being in the known world had looked at everything he had built and everything he had survived, and decided that what he wanted most was simply this: a hand in his, and someone who was not afraid of him, and the quiet, particular sound of a city that was, for once, at peace. The stories that spread across the world in the years that followed were many. Some said the Alpha King had fought a god and won. Some said the god had not even been worth fighting. Some said the Divine Council had considered intervening and changed their mind. Some said they had never even considered it. All of those stories were partly true. None of them were entirely accurate. Kael never corrected any of them because he had never seen the point in managing his own legend. The legend would do what legends do. The truth was simpler and, he thought, better. He had been left alone in a frozen forest at the age of 5, with nothing but the ground beneath him and whatever was living inside him, and he had built something from that. He had protected what he built. He had found, against all reasonable expectation, someone who made him want to keep building. The gods kept their distance. The world found its balance. And the Alpha King walked his bridge in the dark each night, alone and content, with his silver eyes on the horizon, and the knowledge that somewhere behind him, in the warm light of the library or the healer's room, someone was waiting who was entirely unimpressed by all of it. That, he had decided, was the best feeling he had ever known.